So our speaker today is Sarah Bates, who is a journalist for the Socialist Worker newspaper. Just to let everybody know how the meeting will run, Sarah will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we will take questions and contributions from the floor. Sarah will then have a chance to come back in for about 5 minutes at the end to sum up and answer any questions. Just to let people know, the chat function is turned off for security reasons, but if anyone has a question, please feel free to send a message to any of the hosts and we'll be able to read it out. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Sarah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Molly. And thanks everyone for coming. So this meeting is called Let's Talk About Sex, but I think in fact sex feels completely inescapable. From raunchy Regency drama Bridgerton that I'm sure we've all been watching on Netflix to talk of a lockdown baby boom, I think it feels like sex is everywhere all the time. But I want to argue that under capitalism, sex is used to sell as commodities, it's used as the backbone for popular reality TV programmes, and it's splashed across the tabloid front pages. I want to argue that our human relationships are shaped by the class composition of society, and the version of sex and sexuality that we see reflected in popular culture, everything from Bridgerton to pornography and everything in between, is a result of a highly repressive society that narrows and distorts how we are able to explore our sexuality and it distorts the reality of people's relationships. And I also want to argue that real liberation is possible. So when talking about what kind of sexual liberation we want, I think it's probably useful to kind of start by thinking about the parts of capitalism that will be gone if we overthrow it and build a new socialist society that is built on human need rather than capitalist greed. So I don't think we will see women's naked bodies splashed across adverts or across billboards or TV adverts used to sell everything from chocolate bars to luxury cars. I don't think we'll see people trapped in unhappy relationships because they're unable to get divorced or afford to live independently. We'll see an end to LGBT plus oppression, this daily prejudice and discrimination experienced by individuals who don't fit this kind of heteronormative ideal of traditional relationships in traditional families. People will receive proper sex education that won't just talk about the mechanics of penetrative sex between men and women, but something discussion, ideas, education around things about navigating relationships, consent, about sexual pleasure, about people's bodies, and so on. And everyone will have access to proper stigma-free sexual health services. So something like having an abortion or accessing a cervical smear, that will be as accessible as going to the supermarket or the petrol station. We can remove the guilt and stigma surrounding sex and sexuality. But now, today, under capitalism, this is ideologies perpetrated through our society that kind of tells us that sex is something experienced by one kind of person in a certain type of relationship. So in short, I think we can create a society where people are having more sex and having better sex. And this fight isn't just about increasing services, improving education, or challenging people's ideas, important though all of these things are. But socialists like me locate these changes as happening inside a wider revolutionary change in society. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about a wish list or getting lost in speculation for how things might be different. But I do think it's reasonable to say that a socialist transformation of society would mean serious changes in how people are able to live their, explore their sex and sexuality. So what does Marxism have to offer people, fighting for sexual liberation? I think it offers a way forward towards a world where people are able to live with genuine choice over everything in society. We won't just have to kind of live with a world where we're told that things are sort of just the way that they are. It's an opportunity to live with real freedom and dignity, Marxism isn't just about poring over big economics books or looking back over history and analysing it. You know, it's a living, breathing way of looking at the world and thinking about how we can change it and trying to change that. It has something to say for people who want to challenge the very narrow definitions of sex and sexuality that I think we're forced to accept under capitalism. We're not prudes. It's not socialists actually who have a problem with sex. I think it's the capitalists who have a problem with sex. They think we don't deserve anything better than the lives, you know, the lives that we have now. And you see this right at the top of society. You know, you see Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. You know, you see that sort of layer of the world sort of talking about the virtues of marriage and putting into place policy that supports that, you know, and talking about their families, you know, all the while cheating on their wives and making life really hard for working class people, specifically in the way that allows them to kind of build meaningful relationships. Everything in our society is touched by how our system is run for profit. Even, although they feel so personal to us, even our like most intimate relationship. And Karl Marx talked about how all the needs in society, so the individual, family and social needs, are subordinated to the market and reshaped in order to serve the needs of capital. Now that sounds a little bit abstract, so what does he mean? One thing I want to talk about is the family. One of the clearest and most important ways, especially in terms of the effect on women's sexuality, is how social needs are shaped to serve the needs of capital. It can be found within the family. The family plays a vital role in regulating relationships. So the family unit, as we see it today, is a very helpful situation for the tiny minority of rulers who sit at the top of society. This group of capitalists rely on the unpaid labour of working people, mostly women, inside the privatised unit of the family. This labour is used to sort of help power the system. You know, parents raise children, they organise them, socialise them, feed them, clothe them, and so on, until they're adults, and hopefully they're able to kind of do these things for themselves and enter the world with the required levels of skills and socialisation to be effective workers. But the family entrenches into society that women's main role is to care for others. You know, this is mostly happens with children, caring for children. But think about how care and responsibility for parents, you know, parents within the family, for their own parents often falls to women, or for looking after neighbours and things like that often falls to women in society. And I think the COVID-19 crisis has shown this really clearly. You know, in March last year, parents were kind of expected to drop everything and well, not drop everything because people still had to work, but you know, take care of their kids 24/7 when schools correctly you know, shut. But they received like no additional help to be able to do this, you know, and this care didn't fall equally to men and women. One study done by the UN showed that while men and women were both doing more work at home during the pandemic, women were doing 4 times the amount. It also showed that in addition, parents were getting more help from their daughters than their sons. But this is not a situation that comes about in a sort of extreme development like the coronavirus crisis. You know, the work in general, every single day, this work of raising children and caring for others is not taken seriously. If you estimate that a woman on maternity leave works for 16 hours a day, which I think is a bit of a conservative estimate of how many hours you're likely to work, the state is paying her £1.23 an hour to do that job. But this doesn't just happen just because of individual attitudes of individual men and individual women in society. It's not just because men are kind of like naturally lazy and you know, women just live for cleaning and doing laundry. You know, these differences are structured into the system. For instance, often women will take more maternity leave than men because they're paid less. So it makes sense for the unit as a whole for her to take a bigger break than work. That's the same reason why many women end up taking part-time work once kids go to school, and so on. So women are faced with a double whammy. Both unpaid and paid caring roles aren't treated seriously, yet they are absolutely essential to the functioning, to the functioning of the system as a whole. So this unit of family is rooted in a society that is divided by class, and it helps narrow people's expectations about sex and sexuality and about what kind of a world is possible. It performs this role ideologically. The idea of two people, usually a man or a woman, in a long-term monogamous relationship largely goes unchallenged throughout society. But I think, although the reality from this may be quite different, you know, people split up, people lived in, you know, blended families where there might be stepchildren, you know, or maybe they live with grandparents and so on. The notion of the perfect family nonetheless plays a really important role in kind of like bolstering this idea. And let's look at the reality of what it's like, you know, who possibly has the time to sort of undertake multiple sexual or romantic relationships at the same time, alongside a kind of a lifetime of kind of, you know, domestic labour and paid work on top of that as well. So because of all this, it's quite hard, I think, to untangle you know, relationships that are or feel necessary for the kind of the smooth running of family life, and those that are based on genuine kind of sexual desire and sexual interest. But, you know, this isn't to kind of just criticize, just to sort of criticize that, you know, the individuals and the way that people live. You know, for most people, their families and their sort of sexual relationships are where, you know, we're able to kind of access the support and the love and solidarity in what is often quite a difficult world, I think. But there is a flip side to that, in that it's also the environment where all the pressures of work, the pressures of life, you know, the stresses and strains of absolutely everything we experience in this world, you know, that's where you feel it, isn't it? Often that's where people kind of take these things out on each other. You know, there's huge pressure to kind of live a perfect Instagram lifestyle, you know, or to present the image of the happy family, but the reality sometimes doesn't match up to that. People can treat each other in all sorts of terrible ways. Most cases of abuse occur inside people's own homes and within their families, you know, and sexual relationships can also, you know, play host to a variety of incredibly damaging behaviour, you know, possessive behaviour, jealousy, coercive control, domestic abuse. But it's not just about difficult individuals within, you know, families within difficult situations. It's the whole way the nuclear family is structured is based on private property relations that are at the heart of class society. So in the world today, you know, most people spend most of our lives working, don't we? You know, and the way the system is structured is production is based around what can be profitable for bosses, you know, and people often do really repetitive, tedious, boring work that they have very little control over. So the vast majority of people have very little control over themselves in any serious way and their working lives. Now, Karl Marx said that because people lost control over themselves, their lives, and critically their labour, it creates distorted relationships between individuals. And under capitalism, part of the way this is realised is by the process of how sexuality is dehumanised, repackaged and sold back to us as a commodity. So we're told that we can satisfy our needs and desires by simply buying, you know, the latest product. That's why naked women are used to sell luxury cars. That's why women, you know, pretend to enjoy a shampoo so much that they kind of like spontaneously break out into orgasm. You know, that's why we're encouraged to splash out hundreds of pounds on the latest gadgets or sex toys to kind of spice up our sex lives. And writing 150 years ago, you can see some sort of echoes of, you know, about what Marx was talking about about in the world around us, I think, about how we are encouraged to see ourselves as kind of extensions of capitalism. I think things like the dating apps like Tinder and Hinge, you know, these are wildly popular. I've got nothing against these apps or these websites at all. I think they're an absolutely brilliant way to meet other people, probably particularly in the last year where almost every other way to meet people and get together has been impossible. But they do mean that sort of the logic within the app or the website is that you kind of have to market yourself as the most attractive prospect possible, right? So you have to put the absolute best photos of yourself, you have to use the right buzzwords so you come up in people's searches. Maybe you're a little bit dishonest about who you are or what you're looking for, you know, and you want the algorithm to kind of pick you, to put you forward for matches. I mean, some dating websites don't even let you join if you don't match their ideal person. So something like eHarmony, which is a website, you know, this is a website that will reject applicants who they think have been married too many times, or applicants who show signs of suffering from depression in their joining form. So through this process, users of dating websites, they're not just consumers, they're also part of the product. And of course, this rise in dating websites has happened across a backdrop of hammer blows to the lives of working class people. So in particular, young people who form the core basis, I think, of dating app membership. You know, they're the age group that have really driven that forward. They are impacted hugely by poor housing, zero-hours contracts, hugely inflated tuition fees, and the welfare state being really slashed to the bone, particularly in the last decade. All of this has predictable impacts on people's sex lives, doesn't it? You know, one long-term study released last year showed that young adults, it looks like they are having less sex than 20 years ago. And the lead researcher described it as that it was harder for a proportion of the population to establish themselves in society, in the labour market, and perhaps also in the dating market. And actually, a report released last week in Britain showed that pre-COVID, students are certainly less excited about the prospect of sex. Just 16% of those surveyed described themselves as excited at the prospect of sex when they became a student, when they went to university in September. Just 16%. I think this looks a bit of a sort of a bleak picture, doesn't it? Some of the things that I've outlined. But I am completely hopeful that things can be different, because although it can appear as though human beings have always lived in this exact way that we live today, nothing could be further from the truth. You know, throughout human history, people have organised themselves in wildly different ways and can again in the future. And the most developed living experiment we've seen in how workers can organise themselves is how Russian society changed just over 100 years ago. It was a relatively short-lived society where a revolution led by working women and working men smashed away a sexually oppressive society with the royal family and church at the head of it. This revolution put ordinary people in charge. I don't have, you know, any time at all to go too deeply into it, but we can see how when ordinary people are in charge of overthrowing a system and implementing their own, they can unleash a sort of transformation of society, but also the people, the individuals who are participating in this process, who are driving forward this process and responsible for building a new world. You know, in Russia, and, you know, 100 years ago in 1917, people's sights were raised. They were able to demand more of the world than they were, you know, than they were under the deeply repressive society that they were raised in. As a result, sexual relations changed after the revolution of 1917, because absolutely everything changed. Homosexuality was decriminalised and gay marriage was legalised. Women were able to get a divorce and abortion on demand. Relationships between individuals were treated as just that, for the individuals, you know, a matter for those people, not something that the state had kind of any business interfering in. And women's lives changed dramatically. A fine detail was applied by revolutionaries who looked at how to improve women's, you know, lot in life. No stone was left unturned. Everything from taking maternal health seriously, to rolling out education to improve literacy rates among women. And critically, the labour that had previously trapped women inside the home, and the labour that is still overwhelmingly borne by women to this day, was socialised, right? So community canteen, laundrettes and nurseries meant women were saved effectively from thousands of hours of individual and monotonous work, you know, that they did unseen by themselves in their own homes. By locating this work as essential to the running of society, to be and understood to be undertaken on a sort of societal wide level, it transformed you know, the problems of the domestic sphere into a collective effort. So Alexandra Kollontai was a leading Bolshevik during the revolution who was instrumental in theorising women's oppression and key to implementing some of those changes across the new Russia. She wrote extensively on sexual relations and how they were linked to wider society. And she argued for a basic transformation of the socio-economic relationships along communistic lines to solve this, you know, sexual crisis. And why bother why bother kind of talking about Russia? Because I think in some ways it can seem that my life living in London in 2021 seems very different to the lives of the average, well, any Russian woman living over 100 years ago. Thanks, Molly. Thank you. Russia is talked about a lot by revolutionaries like me. You know, that I don't think that's because we're a historical reenactment society. I think it's because it's a great example about how changes don't come about as sort of in incremental ways. They don't come about in sort of a gradual fashion. But they come about through giant leaps and as a result of people fighting for them. In some ways, things have got better and easier for women like me. In other ways, frankly, they've got worse. I recognise a lot about what Kollontai is saying about the sexual crisis. You know, women in my generation are sold the idea that we really can kind of have it all, you know, and we do this through, we're told, by working a 60-hour work week, by raising children, by being incredibly sexually adventurous, practicing mindfulness, and, you know, being carbon neutral and all the rest of it. It's a lot of pressure. You know, I think in lots of ways we're fighting the same way. It's fighting the same fights. Bigots are trying to push back on women's rights to our bodies through consistent attempts to curtail abortion rights. The sexual objectification of women, I think, has reached new heights. You know, porn websites are absolutely everywhere on the internet, flooding the internet with highly edited and glamorized versions of what sex looks like and feels like. And in these, women are generally treated as passive objects of sexual desire. Rarely are they treated with human beings with any kind of sexual agency. And we're told, you know, that there's nothing we can do about it. But I think the best way to battle this kind of like anger at how sexuality is distorted under capitalism is to fight for a better world, on a world where ordinary people have a say. You know, I think we can fight for a world where people have choices and, you know, it's not a place where a tiny minority of rulers wield huge influence over millions of people. Because the world we have now is the one where the best that Tinder bosses do is they boast that they can kind of efficiently deliver you a potential sexual partner through your iPhone or whatever while you're sat on the sofa, you know, or the people in charge of porn websites kind of promise you enough content so you can, you know, masturbate at a few clicks of a button. The goal cannot be simply capitalism without the worst elements of sex under the current system, some of the things that I've talked about. It has to be a world that materially, ideologically addresses all the needs and desires of human beings. And I think it would be a world where it'd be sort of an end of a world where we see these complex, critical elements of our humanity not only ignored, but twisted in specific ways to allow the bosses to trouser profits. So dating sites like OkCupid, one of their taglines is "dating deserves better." I think that's true, but I think every person deserves better than what OkCupid bosses are trying to convince us is the best way to relate to each other. You know, I think the answer lies in a system that works for us all. So it's not just about fighting for better sex under capitalism, although I am for that too. It's about battling for and being part of the fight to change the social, political and economic order that sexually represses us all.